you are abusing yourself in a similar way that you experienced in childhood, except now you're the abuser. You're the one heaping responsibility on your shoulders that you were never meant to carry. And I really believe that making those connections began to change his perspective and ultimately his life, how he lived it, the roles that he carried, the things he started setting boundaries with and saying, no, that's not mine to carry anymore.
Hey, my friend, it is so good to see you. Welcome back to the podcast for the second time in 6 months.
I mean, I'm a frequent flyer at this point.
Let's go.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited for the conversation today, Debra. Water wings are coming off. I want to go right into the 10-foot end of the pool here. I read this stat on Fortune magazine just recently, interestingly. They said this quote, about 82% of employees are at risk of burnout this year, but only half of employers design work with well-being in mind. Now, we're not talking about work at all today. It's a case study, but burnout is so real. I don't even know if you and I have chatted about this offline just as a friend, but this has been a large part of my story this past year. I mean, burnout has felt full tilt, like emotions I've never experienced before. How does this all start? What are the underpinnings of burnout? And we can just take it from there.
You know, before we even get into that, I feel like the first thing that's coming up for me is right. It's funny, at the very end of my book, SelfCare, I write about the song that we used to sing in second grade, "This Little Light of Mine," and how we're going to let that light shine and won't let Satan poof it out, won't let Satan blow it out. But when you think about it, what is the opposite of a light that shines bright? It's a light that's burnt out. It's no longer shining bright because it's been burnt out. And I think that is literally Satan's best strategy to keep our light from shining, is for our light to get snuffed, our light to get burnt out. And it's funny because it's not even spiritual warfare in the sense that we do it to ourselves. So this is why this conversation is so important, because anybody who's listening, who's in a caregiver role, a ministry role, parents, nurses, doctors, teachers, anytime that you're pouring out, you have the susceptibility to get burnt out. And so it's something we have to be so intentional about, assessing our level of fullness on a regular basis so that we don't go there. So you just asked, okay, what does that look like? What does being burned out look like? I think a lot of different things for different people, but I think about a general sense of fatigue, lack of energy. I think of apathy, of just like, I don't even care anymore. Like, I don't have the desire and drive that I used to have. I think of physical responses, such as inability to focus and just having a hard time getting going, and feeling like maybe you wake up and you feel like you're just tired all the time, even after you've slept. And so a lack of desire to do the things that you're called to do. Sometimes you're called to it, but you find that you don't actually care about it as much anymore. Feeling like bitterness and resentment and comparison, and just an overall sense of, I just feel drained. I feel empty. And I think that's not what God intended for us. God intends for us to be filled. So my first question to you, or to anybody listening, would be on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most filled, and 1 being, I feel empty. I'm running on E. It's really important to give yourself a regular assessment. Like, where am I at? What number am I at? How full is my tank? So they can be proactive.
We can go there if you want. I'm happy to be as vulnerable as would be helpful for folks today, but I'll just answer your question, though indirect. last 12 months, I've been at a 1 or a 2.
Wow.
It's a tough place to live. It has been. I don't want to get to the punchline too quickly, but, I'd love to ask for your counselor's take on healing from burnout. Because, Debra, this has been harder than I thought. I didn't see it coming. And what's interesting about all of this is you had mentioned caretakers early on. Well, for 18 years of my life until I was 30, that was my sister's and my life, our dad's life, in the caretaking role for our mom. And I think it crept up in a devastating fashion with my MS diagnosis 9 months after. But a lot has happened in my life in the last year, a lot of unexpected, undesired change. And it was like a month after my book came out. So like mid-April, right after Easter, Debra, it hit me like a truck. I didn't see it coming.
Yeah. A big part of healing from burnout is getting to the why. You probably remember this, but before I even dive into the 6 rhythms that prevent burnout, the 6 rhythms that help you fill up, the very first 5 chapters are about unpacking the why behind the fact that some people struggle with this more than others. Some people are natural caregivers and they care for others at the expense of themselves. Some people are naturally drawn to things that need to be fixed because they've spent the majority of their life fixing things.
That's me.
Filling in the gap, carrying that role of how can I help? How can I help? And I don't know how much you know about the Enneagram.
A lot.
But I joke that Enneagram 2s especially really need this book because they tend to be the helpers, the behind the scenes helpers and fix-its. And but also 3s, the success driven and go and productivity. And there's so many of us that just have a drive towards accomplishment, a drive towards helping, a drive towards giving, and all of that is so good, but somewhere along the way our beliefs about it get misconstrued and we start functioning in a place of unhealth rather than healthy rhythms of give and receive. So you have to get to your why. You have to figure out, why is it hard for me to rest? Why is it hard for me to focus on my own needs? Why is it hard for me to be in tune with what I'm feeling and what I need? And I don't want to be presumptuous here on your territory, but I will tell you, I just finished reading a book called When the Body Says No, that actually talks about the fact that people who have an inability to care for themselves and express what they need, to be in tune with their stress and then to release it in healthy ways, have a higher susceptibility to certain physical ailments. And one of the things on the list was actually MS. So the doctor kind of ties in from his research how these emotional things can kind of build and start to overflow into our body as one of the portions of causation to some of these autoimmune disorders, cancers. He mentions MS, he mentions all kinds of different physical ailments and how a portion of the causation has a lot to do with our own ability to self-regulate, self-care, and ultimately what I would call soul care. So this is a serious conversation. Let's just put it that way. This isn't just about, I'm just a little burnt out. This is life or death, physically and spiritually. I think this conversation has the potential of being life-changing for the health and healing of the church.
Okay, so I want to honor what you just said right there and just give you more space to teach as you want. I want to just clarify this. So When the Body Says No, that's the title of the book? Because I want to put this in the show notes.
Yeah, that was the title of the book I just finished reading. I don't recall who the author is, but he's an MD. And it's just kind of tying in the medical consequences of self-neglect.
The medical consequences of self-neglect. Listen, if you want to stand on the podium and continue, you can take it if you want. I do have another question, like a follow-up, but I think you're onto something, and if you've got more to say, let me just say, take the space for it.
No, let's hear your questions. I'm sure a lot of things will come out of our conversation, but what comes to your mind when you hear that? I mean, the one thing I don't want to do is to make you feel any sort of blame of like, I have this medical issue because of this. Because like I said, according to the book, this is multifaceted, but this is an important area that we do need to address. And that is, where am I at with my own level of self-care, soul care? To me, the opposite of that is self-neglect, right? But one thing I say in my book, both of those things, we think we're being selfish. I don't want to be self-absorbed, so I'm not going to take care of myself. But self-absorbed and self-neglect both have the word self in them, right? They both fixate on self in some way. And I believe when you are depleted and burnt out and tired and empty and sick, guess what the number one thing you focus on in those moments is? Yourself. You feel so bad. There's nothing else that you can think about. When you feel so bad, you unintentionally become the center of your world. So we try to push back on being selfish by self-neglecting. We end up in the same place, which is just still stuck on self.
Yeah, I don't at all receive any guilt about, oh gosh, I wasn't responsible enough, or somehow I let my emotional health go and thus it opened the door. But what I do recognize, and I talked about this in my book too, when considering the broken spirit, is that we're one whole person, spirit, soul, body. And so one domain affects the other.
Right.
And I do think, for instance, I read a book called Widen the Window. Elizabeth Stanley, she's a PhD, counterterrorism in the government, but a trauma specialist as well. She talks in similar fashion. And what I'm really curious about, Debra, is how early in life experiences that don't experience resolution can sometimes, at least in my experience, it seems like they predispose us to certain things. Even emotionally, from an emotional health perspective, emotional maturity and development, all that. But, wow. Yeah, I'm really intrigued by all of that. I've got to get the book, but I guess what I'm curious about now is, like, why does it seem like in the height of burnout, other issues seem to come to the surface? Like, I'll just put myself on blast. It's all good. In the last couple of months, irrational hypochondria, being more compulsive about little stuff. I was going grocery shopping a couple of Fridays ago, and I got it in the car, and I went, did I lock the door? Like I said, totally cool with the vulnerability here, but why is it that these other issues seem to either be exacerbated or rise to the surface when burnout is present in the soul? Is it exhaustion?
Well, if you think about it, when you're burnt out, everything is depleted. So your healthy inhibition, your thinking ahead, your ability to fight back with truth, to see what's around the corner, all of that is depleted as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have the bandwidth to fight the way that you would normally fight, to battle the way that you would normally battle, to invest in the health of your thinking, the health of your emotions, because the bank is depleted. And all of these things require withdrawals.
Wow. Okay.
Like if I'm going to sit here and think in healthy ways about what's coming up tomorrow, I need to have some level of deposit to be able to, okay, let me invest in thinking in healthy ways. When you're depleted, you don't have the bandwidth. You don't have the investment to be able to invest in the healthy rhythms that you normally would to fight back mentally. So you're more susceptible to all of these things, you know?
Yeah, I'm so fascinated already. Moments ago, you alluded to our interaction with these conversations as believers. You argue in your book that Christians struggle with this more than the average person. That caught me off guard. Yeah, that caught me off guard, and I actually totally agree with you. We're often taught, these are your words, to believe that caring for others automatically means not caring for ourselves. We hear the narrative and we act on it, but it's not helpful. What do you think? Pull the thread.
You know, I just hear that rhetoric in the church oftentimes. It's as though loving your neighbor means don't love yourself. But that's not biblical. Jesus never said love your neighbor and don't love yourself. He never said only consider the needs of others. He said consider the needs of others higher than how you consider your own. He said, love your neighbor as you love yourself. To me, there's always a balance in how he presents these things. Like the given was that we are going to be people who care for ourselves. So in that, love other people. The part that we're missing is that some people, because of trauma, because of difficult experiences, because of abuse, because of the brokenness of this world, have never actually learned to care for themselves. And so it's like, okay, I can get behind this message of caring for others and focusing on others and fixating on others. And then we do it at the expense and sacrifice of ourselves, and the scale gets unbalanced, and then we're empty. But my belief is that we are only as effective as we are filled, because God wants us to pour out. And how are you going to pour out if you've got nothing left? How do you pour out if you're empty? How effective can you be when you're depleted and tired and burnt out and sick? How can you go to Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth when you haven't taken care of your physical health and your body is sick and tired because of self-neglect? It's antithesis to doing the work of God, you know? And then consider the fact that we are to be his holy temple. It's like, I don't know if I treat myself that way sometimes. And so there's a whole underlying belief system that I think is linked to our childhood, our experiences in early development, our trauma, our wounds, that we need to heal and adjust our belief system before we even get into this conversation. We need to unpack the why. Why has this been hard for me? Why do I self-neglect? I worked with a pastor, a senior pastor of a church who had this thriving mega church. But when we met for counseling, he was like totally and completely and utterly burnt out. He was like, I'm done. I don't even want to be doing this anymore. I feel totally empty. I feel like I do everything for everybody and I'm done. I'm done. And he was literally on the verge of quitting. And not only that, he was starting to have all these physical symptoms, his skin, a rash, heart issues, having to go to the doctor, and just feeling generally lousy physically. And as we started kind of unpacking his history, this guy knows everything spiritually. Like, he knows God's word in and out. He was radically saved and has a thriving relationship with the Lord. But the problem is, he had never unpacked his trauma history before Christ. And when we started unpacking that story, you know, he was in a house where he was abused by his stepfather for many years. And not only that, in that home, he couldn't have needs, because the only needs that had permission to be vocalized were his stepdad's needs. Anything else, you just held it in for the peace of the home. When you live in that type of chaotic environment, you learn to stuff your needs and not be aware of what you need. And so it became part of who he is. Just stuff my needs and focus on everybody else's needs, because that's what keeps the peace. That's what keeps things from getting chaotic. That's what keeps things safe. So he spent the rest of his life stuffing his needs and stuffing his needs and stuffing his needs, focusing on what everybody else needs. And guess what? When you come to Jesus, that stuff doesn't just go away. You know?
Debra. Right.
So he spent his ministry life stuffing his needs. What needs to be done? How can I help? How can I keep the peace? Until he got to a point where I said to him, you are abusing yourself in a similar way that you experienced in childhood, except now you're the abuser. You're the one heaping responsibility on your shoulders that you were never meant to carry. And I really believe that making those connections began to change his perspective and ultimately his life, how he lived it, the roles that he carried, the things he started setting boundaries with and saying, no, that's not mine to carry anymore. This is the beginning of soul care. We have to get to the why of why we do what we do to begin with.
Let's stay on that why. For a lot of people, I'd be curious to know your take on how much fear is involved in the motivation. In other words, if we go to that pastor and the example of his life, if I don't take care of this, if I don't, then consequences will fall on me. I'm not a good leader. The shame narrative starts. But the underlying motivation is fear. You want to take us under the hood of healing that root of fear, even when it comes to our fear about, it's like our fear of being self-absorbed leads us to self-neglect because we overextend in the other way. I don't know if I'm asking a great question here right now, but I'm just thinking about the connection between a fear motivation about being self-focused, overextended, then causes us to do the very thing that we don't want to do, which is neglect ourselves, and thus we render ourselves ineffective for service.
Right. And I think fear comes in different forms. Fear of losing value. If I stop working, what value do I have to offer, right? Fear of rejection. If I stop doing, they might not like me. Fear of abandonment. I don't want people to leave me, so I have to have something to make them stay. Fear that things are going to implode. You know, if I don't do my part, it's all going to fall apart. We have so many different types of fear. Fear of rocking the boat. Like, I don't want conflict. I don't want stress. I don't want to deal with anyone's uncomfortable feelings, so I'm just going to stuff my own. Like, there's so many different roots to our fear that kind of cause us to do what we do. And these are the things that God needs to help us spotlight and heal. Because I could give you the 6 rhythms of soul care right now, but if you don't get to the root of why they have been a struggle for you to begin with, you might be able to sustain them for a couple weeks, and then you're going to default back to your lack of soul care. These are underlying belief systems that we need to address before we build. We have to lay the foundation first, and then we can build on that with healthy rhythms.
What are some of those underlying belief systems, Debra? You know, folks joined with us today saying, I wonder if this is present in my life. Obviously, they can find out by reading your book, Soul Care. But can we unpack a few of those today? If we're going to build a good foundation, what are some of those destructive narratives in our lives?
Yeah, we mentioned some of them, but just to review, things like, if I don't do it, nobody else will. That's a very self-reliant belief. That's not true. Things like, my value is based on what I do, so I can't stop doing, right? Things like, my needs aren't important because everybody else's needs matter more. Or even, my needs aren't important because there's nobody to help me with my needs, so I'm just going to keep them to myself. it could be value-based, it could be relationship-based, it could be emotions-based, but underneath the surface, we're believing something that's not true. It could be a belief system rooted in the fact that we actually believe that it's right to care for others at the expense of ourselves. And maybe that's what we grew up experiencing, where someone else's needs trumped our own, such as in the case of that pastor, where the stepdad's needs trumped everybody else's. And then you just start believing, okay, I guess this is how it is. Or even in your case, Chris, where the genuine needs of somebody who is ill trumped your needs. It's like their needs are more important right now. And then you kind of start living that way as if that's the general theme of your story. Everybody's needs are more important than my own. Or I don't have an awareness of what I need or how I'm feeling or how healthy I am or how full I am, because I'm always trying to gauge everybody else's level of fullness.
It makes me think of Henry Nouwen's statements about I am what I have, I am what I do, I am what others say about who I am. And those three really can entrap us and keep us locked in that vicious cycle in a way, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Take us into self-care versus soul care then, Debra. I know it in a way it's semantics, but I really love your difference and how we can take this conversation deeper.
Yeah. You know, it's not that I'm not an advocate for self-care. I actually am. But I think how we define self-care tends to be kind of superficial. So it's like, I'm going to go get a massage or a mani-pedi or a hot bath or sit and read a book. And all of those things are important, but they're not deep, long-lasting sources of self-care. We're not just talking about sprinkling water on dry land. We're talking about developing a watering system on the dry land. Like, how am I going to develop a system that lasts and keeps me watered for the long haul? And the only way I have found to figure out what soul care looks like is to look at the life and rhythms of Jesus. The best part of writing soul care was seeing it through the lens of the gospel, and how Jesus, who was fully God, yet fully man, was so balanced. He was so aware of his human capacity, and he honored his human capacity. He didn't push himself outside of capacity. He was so aware of how full he was feeling and when he needed to stop and practice healthy rhythms. And so just watching Jesus do it, I'm like, if he honored his human capacity, how much more do I need to honor my own?
Yeah, we forget about that, don't we?
And I would venture to say it's prideful. It's arrogant to think that we don't have human capacity that needs to be honored, that we don't have a soul that needs to be tended to. So looking at the life of Jesus and just kind of these 6 rhythms that came out through the book that I just believe are so important for us. And to me, that's soul care versus the superficial things that we do to try to kind of appease, put a Band-Aid on, give us a burst of energy, our Starbucks in the morning, our Netflix in the evening, our little rhythms that we do just to kind of feel better, shopping on our Target app, and then sometimes things that we do that are actually unhealthy, right? But ultimately, they're superficial. They're not getting down deep to the health and nourishment of our souls.
Debra, that's so helpful. Then how do we then, on a practical level, gauge fullness in our lives? You juxtapose emptiness and fullness in the book. I'd love to hear how.
Yeah. I think the best way is to think about how effective we feel like we're being, how joyful we feel like we are. The Bible talks about living life abundant, how present we're able to be, how connected we are. If you look at the 6 rhythms of soul care, I would start with those. and ask myself, okay, am I feeling like I am thriving in this specific rhythm? Connecting with people, setting boundaries in our life, feeling in tune to our emotions, practicing rhythms of rest, taking care of our bodies. All of these different things give us a good gauge of our fullness, but I think it's easier to determine our emptiness because those symptoms tend to be uncomfortable. And so I think the easiest question is, okay, how empty do I feel? Like, what's going on right now? How burnt out do I feel? We kind of know when we're thriving. It's harder to kind of pick up on when we're not. So I would say start there.
Will you take us in, to the extent you want, these 6 rhythms that prevent burnout, as you teased earlier in the conversation? Just give us a flyover.
Yeah. So the first one is nourish. And it's kind of focused on caring for our soul by caring for our temple. Like I said earlier, it's hard to go into Judea and Samaria and the ends of the earth when we are sick and tired and depleted. And I think oftentimes we automatically assume it's a spiritual attack when really it's self-neglect. You know, I talk about in one chapter of the book, it might not be a demon. You might just be dehydrated. And it's the idea that there's certain things that Jesus did, such as movement, such as nourishing his body with food, the proper foods, such as hydration. Like the Bible talks so much about food and drink and movement. And so it's kind of taking a deeper dive into how are you doing in these areas when it comes to taking care of your physical temple. Let's start there. Because the body-mind-spirit connection is so real and so important. So nourish. The second rhythm is rest. And it talks about not just our sleep, even though that's part of it, but just our pace and our rhythms of rest throughout our life, our ability to go and stop, and our ability to have margin with our energy and not live at 100%, just like we do with our budget. So that's all about just the cadence of Jesus and the rhythms of rest that he practiced, being able to tune into what we need and respond. You know, when Jesus was exhausted, he didn't just push through. He stopped to rest.
And so many of us do push through.
We push through. We think it's a weakness instead of, oh, my body's signaling. I better pay attention to what my body needs. We see it as a weakness and we judge ourselves and then we push even harder, which is the opposite of what Jesus did. So rest and then connect, which kind of assesses our life-giving relationships, goes under the hood of what keeps us from life-giving relationships. Fear of rejection, past wounds, our inability to be vulnerable. Why? Where is that rooted from? What does it look like to have healthy, life-giving relationships and friendships? And why Jesus practiced those type of give and take relationships. You know, Jesus didn't just give in his friendships. He also received. And what does that mean for us? How good we are receiving in our friendships. I could give you examples, but they're all throughout the book. And then we've got protect, which is setting healthy boundaries, learning to say no and not now. And understanding that when we set boundaries around our life, we're not just protecting our health, we're protecting our calling, the calling that God has on our life. And so this is important. And even Jesus set boundaries, and we kind of deep dive into how Jesus set boundaries. Another rhythm is probably my favorite one for me personally was savor. It's about being present and enjoying life. I'll never forget the day when I was talking to the Lord about my calling. I've always been one of those people that just feel like God has called me to serve, to help, to heal. And I was kind of at a fork in the road. Okay, Lord, what do you want me to do? What's next? And I remember him saying, I just want you to enjoy life. I just want you to have fun. I just want you to enjoy life. And I'm like, Are you sure? Did I hear you? It's not computing. But just to savor life. For those of us who are productivity wired, performance based, what am I doing for God? Learning just to be with him, learning just to enjoy life and what he's given me. And so savor was such a beautiful part of writing this book. And it goes through being present, enjoying life, as well as Thanksgiving and celebration. And so those rhythms that Jesus practiced and how he modeled that for us. And then the last rhythm is tuning in to our inner world and just being aware of what's going on inside of us, not just what's going on around us, which of course, as a counselor, I've written so many books about that portion of how important it is to have a healthy inner world, have insight and understanding of our emotions and what's going on underneath the surface of our life. And Jesus modeled that so well. He was so in tune to his inner world and responded to his emotions in a healthy way. So these are kind of the overview of the 6 rhythms. And then each chapter really goes into detail, as well as how you can begin to assess and apply some of these things to your own life.
That's so good. There's a mature perspective about all of this that I think is really important regarding the stewardship of our lives. You wrote this, that our body is not our own. We are not our own. This is antithetical to every message we hear in culture today, specifically in this lane. You want to unpack that?
If I am my own, I get how it could feel selfish to focus on me. But if I'm truly God's temple and I have a calling on my life, then taking care of this temple is the prerequisite to doing the work that God has called me to do. It's not just a luxury, it's a necessity. And so reframing how we think of it and making sure we have a healthy perspective on it changes a lot in how we act out some of these things.
You also touched on how God is longing to help us bring our bodies back into alignment by his power and his strength. How does this happen? What's the full picture of what this looks like, considering a holistic perspective on life, spirit, soul, body?
Yeah, I always talk about how the best way to love God is to be aligned with him in every area of our life. When the disciples asked Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? He said, love the Lord your God. How? With all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Heart represents our emotional health, soul, our spiritual health, mind, our mental health, and strength, our physical health. There are different parts of us that we need to bring into alignment in order to be able to love God at full capacity and to love him well and to love others well. We can't even love others well until we get that right, because then he goes on to say, love your neighbors then as you love yourself. But it starts with getting ourselves in alignment. And sometimes our alarms are going off and we just ignore them. We put them on mute. Okay, I'm just going to ignore that and keep going until we break down and shut down, until our little light is no longer shining. And spiritual warfare is legit and real, but sometimes we aid the enemy in spiritual warfare by neglecting to care for ourselves. And we see people falling from the height of ministry because of a lack of fullness. When you are full, you don't go to empty things to fill you up. When you are full, you don't need to run to pornography and adulterous relationships and substances and alcohol to take the edge off, because you are filled to overflowing. And I really believe that's the life that God calls us to. It's a privilege to be able to sit and be filled in healthy ways. And not only that, it keeps us living out of our overflow, living out of healthy places, living out of our abundance. And I don't think this is just theory. I think this is what God calls us to practice, to be filled by him, with him, and through him.
Yeah. Debra, I think one of the things I value about you as a friend, but also just being on the pod here often, is the consistency in your ministry, but also your practice. I think one of the themes I gather as I read this book and step into this new work of yours is that soul care isn't a life hack, it's a path.
1000%.
Yeah. What's important to know about that specific note? Because again, I don't want folks to walk away from this conversation and go, well, here we go, it's just another life hack. Like I say, transformation is a daily engagement.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a total upheaval of our foundation and our belief system of what it means to care for ourselves and how that honors God, because empty people cannot do the work that God has called them to do. Like, we need to be filled and to really believe that God's desire is for us to be filled. I mean, I spent some time in soul care unpacking some of the passages of to prove that God wants us to be filled, not empty. And so when we really believe that theologically and psychologically, it begins to change how we live our life. It's not just these external tweaks. It's a completely different way of living. And I'll tell you what, Chris, I want to practice what I preach. I don't want to go through this book launch season and do more than capacity and burn out just to get the message out. Like, if I truly trust God, I'm going to do what I can and stop there. And then I'm going to trust that he's going to do what only he can do. I think soul care is also our battle cry of trust. Like, Lord, I trust you with my limited capacity, with my limited efforts. I trust you with the small loaves and fish that I have. And I'm going to do what I can do. And then trust and believe that you're going to do what you can do. I don't have to kill myself because you've already done that for me. You've already sacrificed yourself for me. And I'm going to do what I can do and trust and believe that the rest is in your hands. I mean, to me, soul care is really asking, do I trust God? Am I able to rest because I trust that he's going to do it for me? Am I able to stop producing and performing because I trust in the work that he's going to do? Am I able to stop feeling like I have to live this productivity-based life because I know that he's the only one that can multiply and open doors? Am I able to do what I can do and then trust that God is the only one that can do what he could do? I think ultimately it's a question of a posture of trust. And the beautiful thing about Jesus is that he doesn't judge us when we're there, but he invites us, like, let me prove it to you. Just cease your striving and see what I can do. And so soul care, I mean, this is deep. We could talk about this for hours. I know this is a deep conversation, and it's going to require a lot of people to have to really look in before they start to look out at what they want to do differently. But I do believe that when we catch this, it can be transformative for the church. Because can you imagine what a healthy, filled church functioning out of their overflow could do for this world? Can you imagine if we shine so brightly because we weren't burnt out, what that could do to the darkness?
You've given us the period on this sentence already. We've got to look in first before we look out. I think that's a great place to land this conversation. But Debra, anything else today? I'm really thankful. It's always not only a joy to just have a conversation with you, but you're giving me so much more to think about in my own life, walking through a season of very real senses of burnout and just, I'm exhausted.
Yeah.
So thankful, very thankful.
Well, God invites you into his rest. He invites all of us into his rest. And I'm ready to take that invitation.
Amen. Me too. Yeah, for sure. Well, the new book is available right now everywhere books are sold. You're a fantastic follow on Instagram and all the places. But just in case folks don't know where to find you, where can they do that?
I love to hang out on Instagram at Debra Fileta. My website is debrafileta.com, DebraFileta, debrafileta.com. I have an amazing team of counselors for those of you who are looking to do some deeper work at debrafileta.com/counseling. And you can connect with me there anytime. I'm here to help.
You're a gem. Thanks for being here, my friend. I really believe in you. And I know this message is both timely and anointed for this moment in time.
Well, thank you for having me.
You're
as
welcome.
usual, Chris.
It's a joy.